Imagine, imagine for a second trying to run a country that is just completely surrounded by hostile armies.
Yeah, not exactly an ideal scenario.
Right, and you have like absolutely no military of your own to speak of. So your survival relies entirely on forged documents, smuggled letters, and literally the strategic placement of ancient bones.
It sounds like fantasy, but it was very, very real.
It really was. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you are traveling back to the turbulent 8th century to explore the papacy of Pope Paul I. We've been digging through a really fascinating stack of sources for this, everything from academic papers analyzing Franco-Papal alliances.
Heavy reading, but so good.
Very heavy. And detailed architectural profiles of ancient Roman churches, like San Silvestro in Capite and Santa Maria Antiqua, along with some great insights from historical podcasts that chronicle the origins of Vatican City.
It's just a truly remarkable period to examine, you know? Because we're looking at a time when the map of Europe is essentially being violently redrawn, and the modern concept of the Papal States is, it's really just beginning to solidify out of sheer necessity.
Exactly. And our mission today is to unpack how Pope Paul I used these brilliant, desperate, and honestly, sometimes downright deceitful tactics to save Rome from just being completely wiped off the map.
Yeah, he had to get creative.
He did. And in doing so, he essentially invented the blueprint for the Papal States. And he did it using a geopolitical strategy that historians refer to as, wait, what is the specific term they use in the literature?
The term is the spatialization of orthodoxy.
Right, spatialization of orthodoxy, which sounds incredibly dense.
It does, yeah. But it basically just means turning the physical geography of a city into an ideological weapon.
Yeah.
To really grasp what Paul I accomplished with this strategy, we kind of have to understand the sheer volatility of the stage he stepped onto.
Because it was a mess.
A complete mess. So the year is 757. Pope Stephen II has just died, and his brother, Paul, takes over the papacy.
And the sources emphasize that this is actually the first recorded instance of the papacy passing directly between siblings, right? Like, it feels like they were establishing a sort of bureaucratic dynasty right out of the gate.
Oh, they absolutely were. I mean, these brothers were from a noble Roman aristocratic family. They're traditionally identified as the ancestors of the powerful Orsini clan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were orphaned early on and raised entirely within the Lateran Palace. So Paul wasn't just, a spiritual leader dropping in from the outside. He was deeply, deeply integrated into the administrative and diplomatic machinery of the Roman Curia from childhood.
He knew all the players.
Exactly. He knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, politically speaking, and he needed every single ounce of that experience because literally upon his election, he is immediately boxed in by three massive geopolitical threats.
The ultimate tripartite powder keg.
Yes. Perfectly put.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is where the reality of the situation really hits you. Who exactly is closing in on Rome in 757?
Well, the volatility is coming from three distinct directions. First, you have the Lombard kingdom under King Desiderius.
Right.
And the Lombards control much of northern Italy at this point. Desiderius essentially just wants to conquer the entire Italian peninsula, absorbing Rome in the process.
So threat number one, a physical invasion.
Exactly. Then second, there's the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire under Emperor Constantine V.
Sometimes called Copernicus, right?
Yes,
Indeed.
unfortunately for him. And he is determined to reclaim Italy for the East. But more dangerously, Constantine is a staunch iconoclast.
Meaning he wants to violently destroy all religious images and icons.
Right. And we really have to look at his underlying motivations here. It's not just that he hates art. The Byzantines had recently lost massive swaths of territory to expanding Islamic armies. And many in the Byzantine court, including the emperor, interpreted these defeats as divine punishment.
Like God was actually mad at them.
Exactly. They believed God was angry because Christians were venerating statues and paintings, which they viewed as a direct violation of the biblical commandment against idolatry.
Wow. Okay. So destroying art literally became a state-mandated security measure for the Byzantines.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. It was geopolitical self-defense in their minds. And then finally, you have the third faction. This is the Frankish kingdom up in modern-day France, under King Pepin the Short.
And Pepin is the wild card.
He is. He's the power the Pope desperately needs to act as his bodyguard against the other two.
So, how does a leader with a lot of spiritual authority but absolutely zero standing army actually defend a city against heavily armed, ambitious kingdoms. Like, it feels so much like being the smallest kid on the playground, trying to survive just by playing the bullies against each other.
That is a highly accurate analogy, because Paul couldn't fight the Lombards on the battlefield. He had no troops. He had to fight them diplomatically, utilizing literally every psychological and political lever available to him.
Which is what leads to one of the most audacious espionage moments in papal history, right?
Yeah.
I was reading about this standoff in 758, and it reads like a Cold War spy thriller.
It really does.
The Lombard king, Desiderius, actually marches his army on Rome. He's out there suppressing revolts in nearby territories, and he decides to use his military superiority to extort Pope Paul. How exactly did Paul navigate being held at sword point?
Well, Desiderius forces Paul into this incredibly tight diplomatic trap. He essentially demands that Paul write a letter to the Frankish king Pepin, and Desiderius dictates the terms himself.
He's literally ghostwriting the Pope's letter.
Yes. He says Paul must beg Pepin to return several Lombard hostages that the Franks are currently holding, and Paul must concede to a list of Lombard territorial claims. And if Paul does all this, Desiderius promises to return the contested city of Imola to the papacy.
So Paul seemingly just caves.
Seemingly, yes. He writes the letter, he seals it, and he hands it over to his ambassadors. That's Bishop George of Ostia and a Roman priest named Stephen. And they are tasked with traveling back to the Frankish court to deliver it.
But the sources reveal he didn't just hand over that one letter.
No, and what's fascinating here is just the sheer risk of his countermove.
Yeah.
Paul actually gave his ambassadors two distinct letters.
The classic double cross.
Exactly. The official letter, the one meant to be shown to the Lombard guards if they got stopped to secure a safe passage, says exactly what Desiderius demanded. It publicly begs Pepin to make peace and return the hostages.
Right.
But a second secret letter was smuggled right alongside it. And this secret document tells Pepin the absolute truth. It warns the Frankish king that Desiderius is secretly allying with the Byzantines to conquer Ravenna and then march on Rome.
Oh my God.
Yeah. In this hidden letter, Paul just implores Pepin to send a Frankish army immediately to crush the Lombards.
It is exactly like a hostage being forced to record a proof-of-life video saying, "Oh, everything is fine, I'm being treated wonderfully," while secretly blinking SOS in Morse code to the camera.
That's spot on. And, historians in later centuries, particularly in the 19th century, they sometimes heavily criticized Paul for this. They called his politics full of deceit and fraud.
Because it wasn't very holy of him.
Exactly. But if you're examining the reality on the ground, these actions were dictated by the extreme vulnerability of the Roman See. Statecraft in the 8th century wasn't about moral purity. It was about raw survival.
Right, but the heartbreaking part of this brilliant piece of espionage is that the cavalry doesn't actually come charging over the hill.
Yeah.
Pepin reads the secret letter, but he refuses to send his army.
Yeah, he leaves him hanging. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Pepin's refusal actually makes complete geopolitical sense.
How so?
Well, the Frankish king has his own massive realm to govern up north. He really doesn't want to be constantly bogged down in endless, expensive Italian wars, so he opts to send mediators instead, his brother and a duke, to try and talk Desiderius down diplomatically.
Which has to be so frustrating for Paul.
Oh, for Pope Paul, it's a terrifying wake-up call. He realizes right then that a permanent Frankish military garrison isn't coming. Since physical military backup isn't a long-term guarantee, Paul realizes he has to find a completely different psychological way to bind the Franks to Rome.
And his solution is to weaponize ancient relics.
Yes, he turns to the bones of the saints, specifically the remains of St. Petronilla.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this because it is just brilliant. Petronilla was traditionally believed to be the daughter of St. Peter, right?
That was the belief, yes.
And so in 757, Paul digs up her remains and her massive marble sarcophagus from a catacomb outside the city walls. And he moves them to a special, highly prominent mausoleum right next to Old St. Peter's Basilica.
And this was a deeply calculated alliance-building measure, because King Pepin and his sons had previously been anointed as the adopted sons of St. Peter.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. By elevating St. Petronilla, Paul effectively made her the adopted patroness, like the spiritual sister of the Frankish royal family.
But he takes it even a step further to absolutely lock Pepin in. The sources mention an embassy in 758 where King Pepin sends a baptismal shawl belonging to his newborn daughter, Gisela, all the way down to Rome.
That's right.
And Paul takes this shawl and places it directly at the shrine of St. Petronilla. What is the actual mechanism at play here? Because how does a baby blanket stop a Lombard invasion?
Well, in the 8th century, spiritual kinship was a legally and socially binding institution. By receiving the baptismal shawl and ceremonially placing it at the shrine, Pope Paul officially became the compator.
The compator.
Yeah, the co-father or godfather to the Frankish king's daughter. And under canon law and the societal norms of that era, spiritual kinship carried the exact same weight as biological blood.
That is wild.
Paul literally turned a precarious military treaty into sacred, unbreakable family ties. So if Pepin ignored Paul's future pleas for help, he wasn't just breaking a political treaty, he was abandoning his own family.
That is an unbelievable use of diplomatic leverage. Just brilliant. But protecting the city with Frankish family ties only works if the city survives long enough for the Franks to actually care.
You're very true.
Because the Lombards were still physically devastating the surrounding countryside, laying siege to Rome, and plundering the ancient catacombs.
Right, and the desecration of those suburban cemeteries was viewed as a catastrophic spiritual crisis. Relics in the 8th century were not just symbolic mementos, they were believed to be literal, physical conduits of divine power.
So stealing them is like stealing power.
Exactly. Having barbarian armies smashing into tombs and stealing these conduits was completely intolerable. So to counter this, Paul initiates a massive, systematic campaign to dig up the bones of popes and martyrs from these decaying catacombs and move them safely inside the fortified walls of Rome.
Wait, isn't there a massive theological contradiction here, though? Digging up the graves of martyrs, breaking apart their skeletons, and hauling them into the city to use as a political border wall feels incredibly sacrilegious. Did anyone at the time push back against him desecrating these sacred resting places?
Oh, absolutely. That is a crucial tension. For centuries, Roman tradition strictly dictated that the dead must remain untouched in their original burial sites outside the city walls. Disturbing a martyr's grave was considered a grave sin.
So how did he justify it?
Paul basically argued that the emergency overrode the tradition. He issued formal decrees stating that because the Lombards were already desecrating the graves, they were even using some catacombs as animal pens, moving the bones, was an act of holy rescue, not sacrilege.
Wow, okay. And this massive relocation project centers heavily around the church of San Silvestro in Capite. The sources outline how Paul takes his own ancestral family home, which, amazingly, happened to be built over an ancient pagan temple of the sun.
Talk about symbolism.
Right, and he transforms it into a fortified monastery to house these rescued bones.
He is physically consolidating the sacred heritage of early Christianity within the defensible borders of his city. He translates the relics of Pope St. Sylvester, Pope St. Stephen, and Pope St. Dionysius directly into this new complex.
There is one detail from the architectural profile of San Silvestro that I just cannot get out of my head. The church gets its name, in capitis, meaning of the head, because it is famous for housing what is purported to be the head of John the Baptist.
Oh yes, the reliquary.
The texts describe this reliquary in incredibly visceral detail. It's a skull, but it's missing its lower jaw.
Oh, right.
And so to fill it out, the jaw area is remodeled with wax and stucco. And then, to hold the fragile bone together, there is a rigid silver half cap in the back that forms a silver chin guard underneath.
It's quite an image.
And sitting right on top of this skull is a golden crown made of 18 hinged plates, absolutely covered in rubies, sapphires, and pearls.
It's a striking, just overwhelming visual. And this brings us right back to that concept of the spatialization of orthodoxy. Paul is turning the physical geographic map of Rome into an impregnable fortress of Christian heritage.
Right.
By moving the holiest artifacts of the Christian world inside the city walls and encasing them in staggering wealth, he is making Rome itself a massive reliquary.
He's betting that even a hostile, expansionist king like Desiderius would hesitate to violently sack a city that is packed to the brim with the glowing, jeweled remains of the apostles and martyrs.
Precisely. He is using religious awe as a border wall. It's essentially an invisible shield constructed entirely out of reverence and fear of divine retribution.
Okay, so Paul successfully uses these bones to build a psychological wall against the Lombards. But physical borders were only half his problem. He still had the Byzantine Emperor trying to wage an ideological war against Rome.
Right, which brings us back to the iconoclastic controversy. Emperor Constantine V had recently convened the Council of Heria in 754. Over 300 Eastern bishops attended that, and they officially declared the veneration of religious images to be heresy. Constantine demanded that Rome fall in line and destroy its art.
And Paul's response is just an absolute refusal.
He fiercely defied the emperor. He publicly condemned iconoclasm as heresy. Furthermore, he opened Rome's doors, granting political asylum to Greek-speaking monks who were fleeing persecution and execution in the East.
Which is a huge political statement on its own.
Definitely. And Paul even gave these refugee monks that very monastery at San Silvestro in Capite to live in, providing them a safe haven to continue their artistic and theological traditions.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Paul doesn't just offer these exiled Greek artists a place to hide. He actively deploys them on the cultural front lines.
Yes, he puts them to work.
We look at the ancient church of Santa Maria Antiqua, located right in the Roman Forum at the foot of the Palatine Hill. Paul commissions these monks, who are trained in these beautiful, fluid, Hellenistic techniques of light and shadow, which stand in stark contrast to the rigid art of the Byzantines. He gets them to paint stunning frescoes all over the church.
And the focal point of this artistic counteroffensive is found in the main sanctuary, on what is known as the palimpsest wall.
And it's called a palimpsest because the wall actually has 6 different layers of decoration painted over each other from different eras, right?
Exactly. It's like a geological core sample of Roman art.
Yeah, I was looking at the architectural profile for Santa Maria Antiqua, and there's a detail about the palimpsest wall that honestly confused me a bit. Paul's artists painted this massive scene depicting Christ in majesty, flanked by prominent saints. But Pope Paul I has himself painted into this mural.
He does, yeah.
He is standing right there in the presence of Christ. And strangely, while the saints have normal round halos, Paul is painted wearing a blue square halo. What does that specific shape mean?
That square halo is the absolute key to understanding the entire mural. In the artistic conventions of the 8th century, a round halo was strictly reserved for divine figures or saints who had already passed on. A square halo explicitly signaled to the viewer that the subject was currently alive at the time the portrait was painted.
I have to ask, isn't that incredibly arrogant? To commission a painting of yourself standing shoulder to shoulder with Jesus while you're still breathing, just to stick it to the Byzantine Emperor.
Well, to a modern observer, it absolutely looks like monumental ego. But this raises an important question about how art functioned in late antiquity. This was not a vanity project. It was highly coordinated geopolitical propaganda.
How does painting yourself with a square halo function politically? Like, what's the message?
By placing himself alive alongside both Greek and Latin church fathers right next to Christ, Paul was making a massive public statement to any Byzantine diplomat who walked into that church. He was visually asserting that the Bishop of Rome, not the emperor in Constantinople, held ultimate universal jurisdiction over Christian tradition. Yeah, he is using paint and plaster to claim total ideological sovereignty. The visual message is basically, the emperor in the East destroys art in a panic. I preserve it, and I stand in the unbroken line of Orthodox truth.
It's staggering. I mean, for a decade, Paul brilliantly holds this fragile house of cards together. He survives extortion through secret espionage letters. He legally binds the Frankish king to him by becoming a godfather. He turns Rome into a spiritual fortress with a border wall of bones. And he fights a geopolitical war using Hellenistic frescoes.
He really was an absolute master of leveraging soft power when hard power simply wasn't an option. But we do have to look at the internal cost of these maneuvers. Systems that are built entirely around one mastermind's micromanagement, especially when funded by heavy wealth consolidation, usually collapse the exact moment the pressure is released or the leader is gone.
Because we've been talking about all these brilliant international moves, but paying for refugee Greek monks and building jeweled shrines for skulls couldn't have been cheap. Was the local Roman population entirely on board with this?
They definitely were not. And this is where the narrative tension finally snaps. Because to manage all this newly claimed territory and handle these incredibly complex international negotiations, Paul implemented highly centralized administrative reforms.
Meaning he took power away from the locals.
Precisely. He effectively concentrated all political and economic power within a very close-knit circle of clerical officials at the Lateran Palace. And in doing so, he completely bypassed Rome's traditional military aristocracy.
The wealthy landowners and local dukes who, up until now, used to run the city's defenses.
Exactly. The people you really don't want to anger. They felt totally cut out of the power dynamic. And the sources note that while Paul himself was widely known for his personal charity to the poor, some of his top administrative subordinates, the men enforcing his vision, ruled the city with a tyrannical, heavy hand.
Oh, man. So the resentment among the sideline military elite was just boiling under the surface for years.
Boiling is the right word. Which brings us to the summer of 767. Seeking relief from the intense Roman heat, Paul retires to a country estate near the Basilica of St. Paul fuori le mura, and there he falls terminally ill. On June 28, 767, Pope Paul I dies.
Yeah.
And the absolute second he is gone, the stability he spent 10 years engineering just violently shatters.
The military aristocracy saw their window of opportunity.
Exactly. With the mastermind dead, the suppressed anger exploded right into the open. The historical accounts describe the ensuing events so vividly. A powerful nobleman named Duke Toto of Nepi literally bursts into Rome, leading an armed Tuscan militia.
A full-on invasion from the inside.
Yeah. They storm the city, and despite the fierce, desperate opposition of Paul's remaining papal officials, Duke Toto violently seizes control of the Lateran palace.
And Toto forcibly installs his own brother onto the papal throne, right?
His brother, Constantine II. And what makes this so scandalous is that Constantine was a layman.
Wait, just a regular guy?
Just a layman. He wasn't a cardinal. He wasn't even a priest. He was just a nobleman who was hastily ordained in a matter of days purely to secure his family's grip on the city's wealth and political power.
It sparks a violently bloody succession crisis that just plunges Rome into chaos. It's a complete mess that eventually requires the rules of papal elections to be permanently changed.
Yes, specifically barring laymen from being elected and restricting the voting pool to cardinal priests and deacons.
It's wild to think that after 10 years of outsmarting foreign kings and emperors, it was the local Roman politics, the very people he sidelined to fund his massive vision, that tore his administration apart.
It proves that while Paul could manage the macro-politics of Europe through sheer diplomatic genius, the micro-politics of Rome were impossible to suppress forever. But despite the bloody aftermath of Duke Toto's invasion, Paul's core legacy was already cemented. Through his letters, his alliances, and his architecture, he had successfully transitioned the papacy away from the orbit of the Byzantine Empire and firmly anchored it to the west.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? When you walk through a historic city, or when you visit a museum, or if you ever find yourself standing in a famous ancient church like Santa Maria Antiqua, looking at a faded fresco with a square halo, you aren't just looking at art.
Not at all.
You aren't just looking at religion. You're looking at the fossilized remains of a brilliant, desperate survival strategy. Architecture, painting, and the burial of bones. These were the geopolitics of the ancient world. They were the weapons leaders used when they didn't have an army to deploy.
And that leaves us with a fascinating, honestly almost unsettling thought to consider. Today, we can look back at the 8th century and clearly recognize that the relocation of bones to San Silvestro or the painting of a square halo in a Roman forum were calculated life-or-death political chess moves.
Right.
It forces you to look at our modern world and wonder what purely cultural, scientific, or artistic mega-projects being funded by world governments right now will historians 1,000 years from now look back on and recognize as desperate geopolitical survival maneuvers.
That is a wild thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope this makes you look twice at the history hidden in the monuments all around you and encourages you to keep questioning the stories behind the stone. Until next time.